Hey folks, I'm Alex Dowd.
And I'm Katie Rife.
Later this month, the Criterion Collection will release a spiffy new box set of films by the Hong Kong director Wong Kar Wai. To honor the occasion, we're looking back on the career of this great and beloved filmmaker. Where should a Wong neophyte begin with this glorious, influential body of work? We'll discuss that and more on this week's episode.
Welcome to Film Club.
All right, Katie. So, as film critics, you and I will occasionally get questions from people, be it family or other people, and these kind of reoccurring questions about our tastes and about what filmmakers we love, what movies we love. What's your favorite movie is one that comes up a lot. Another one though is people will sometimes ask me, and I'm sure they ask you as well, who your favorite filmmaker of all time is.
Yes, absolutely. Many times.
I don't know about you. I find that kind of an impossible question to answer, generally.
Oh, sure. And a favorite anything is just so hard to, I can give you a list, but one favorite is really hard to do.
Well, I think for me, what it comes down to is that's an answer that's constantly in flux. And it depends, I go through periods where I'm really into one filmmaker I think I could provide a list if somebody was like, who are your 20 favorite filmmakers of all time?
Right, yeah.
This is the 20 I could present, and some years I find myself gravitating towards more or the other. But, our taste evolves as we grow older, and also sometimes it's like when you're reading, sometimes you'll go on a kick where you read several books by the same author, by the same novelist or something, and then you go, okay, well, I think I need to set that writer aside and look at something else for a little while,
Oh, I've definitely done that. Been like, this was fun, but I need a break.
Exactly. Yep.
Absolutely. I've done that before. Well, you're talking about different periods in your life. I think it's interesting. I think you and I both had kind of our Wong Kar Wai period around the same time.
Yeah. For sure. Well, I would say the introduction of my love of this filmmaker started around the same time. Wong is an answer that I will sometimes provide when people ask me who is your favorite filmmaker of all time.
I have before too.
Yeah, and he's an easy filmmaker to love, and I think that you and I think both discovered Wong Kar Wai's work in college when we were both college kids.
Yes. Studying film in college, a whole new world opens up to you. And this one, we'll talk a lot more about this, but his films are so romantic and so visually ravishing that they're just really, really exciting and so distinctive that it really is easy to latch onto him as a filmmaker, like you said, right?
Yeah. And I'll say this too. I was in film school at the time, so I found something instantly inspiring about his work because he's somebody who is doing so much with the camera and with mood and with sensation right from the get-go. Chungking Express was my introduction to his work, and I felt watching that film, that I had never seen something like a filmmaker make something that was so damn cool.
Yeah,
that
really
was my
cool
into his work.
And really beautiful and romantic and sexy and sensual. A lot of really seductive aspects to his work.
Very much so. And I think we'll talk more about what appeals to us individually about his work. We should say, for those who do not know his work, just a quick introduction to him. Wong Kar Wai is a Hong Kong filmmaker. I would say he is one of the most influential filmmakers probably of the late 20th century.
Absolutely. Definitely most influential, filmmakers to come out of Hong Kong. He's probably the leading filmmaker of his generation in Hong Kong.
Yeah, he's of a younger generation than John Woo, is right? He's Woo would be sort of the probably the most influential of all Hong Kong filmmakers.
Absolutely.
But Wong is right up there too.
Right.
And they have some, again, I think we'll talk a little bit more about some of their shared roots as well. But, so he's, Wong, you can see, even if you've never seen a Wong Kar Wai film, you have seen traces of his style in other people's films. I mean, he has inspired filmmakers in the East. I mean, you have Kim Kai-duk, Bi Gan, Lao Ye, Dao Yinan, all of those filmmakers. There's a little bit of Wong Kar Wai in them. But in the West too, I mean, you have people like Sofia Coppola and Barry Jenkins and even Harmony Korine have picked up on aspects of his style and ran with them.
Yeah, I think in terms of like the sensual aspect of his films and just how evocative and visually beautiful they are, Barry Jenkins is the like if you're familiar with Barry Jenkins' work, you get a similar kind of tactile, really moving quality from watching the images in Wong Kar Wai movies, the same way you do with Barry Jenkins.
Yeah, there's this kind of romantic, bittersweet, nostalgic glow that is sometimes in Wong's work. I mean, again, if you've seen Moonlight, the last section of Moonlight is more or less an extended tribute to Wong Kar Wai. I mean,
it's a very Wong Kar Wai kind of story at the end there, for sure.
And I knew watching the film, when I saw the film at Toronto the year it premiered, I was like, this is giving me Wong Kar Wai feels. You know, I was like, I knew I loved the film in that last segment. I was like, he is tapping into, because a lot of filmmakers have imitated Wong Kar Wai over the years. Jenkins is one who I think who's gotten to some of the soul of his work. You know? Exactly.
Because like Wong Kar Wai is also, you know, we're talking about the way they make you feel, but also the look of his films is very, very distinctive. You know, a lot of bright saturated color, a lot of neon. Like if you saw Only God Forgives, the Nicholas Winding Refn movie, like that visual style is kind of along the same lines of what Wong Kar Wai is working with.
Totally. You know, so he's built this remarkably unified body of work as well. He's made 10 features since the late 80s. And the actual genre that they occupy varies a little bit, but they're all mostly these kind of moody, languid, expressive dramas about heartsick or lovelorn people, and often in the city, not always in the city, but often in the city. I think of his cinema as a cinema purely of romance. I mean, I do think that, however you want to, I mean, not every single one of his films is exclusively exclusively a love story, but they are all about a kind of romance. And
they all have those elements in them. Like, you know, I mean, there are none of his films that I would say are not romances in some way. Most of them are exclusively, primarily romances.
It's true.
Yeah, I'm glad you brought up the city, because I think that the city is a really important part of Wong Kar Wai's, you know, kind of auteur signature, in the sense that a lot of his, you know, we were talking about visually, they're very cohesive, but also thematically, they're very cohesive. And one of his favorite themes is this really poignant theme that I kind of see as being kind of inherent to city life, which is it's a lot of themes about short-lived affairs or chance encounters that like reshape the course of someone's life. And to me, that is a quintessentially city thing, because when you live in the city, you encounter thousands of different people every single day. You know, you might, in Chungking Express, the characters literally run into each other.
Yep.
You know, they bump into one another. And that can completely change your life. And just that sort of like idea, and the city life can be very alienating too. And so that idea of like millions of people, all these lonely little planets kind of orbiting, you know, close to each other, but never really touching, is a really big point. Like, that's where a lot of the poignancy in his work comes from, I think.
I totally agree, and I think that's an astute point about his work. He really he gets the idea of a city as, well, for one thing, he gets the idea of being lonely in a crowd. You know, that is a big Wong thing, because a lot of, like, some of his best films are set in Hong Kong, and they're set in these kind of bustling cities, but you're following these characters who feel detached from everyone around them. But there are all these possibilities for connections and for misconnections all around them. I mean, one of his signature images, I'm kind of getting ahead of us here, because we're going to talk a little bit more about his style, but there is a signature image that he does with step printing that involves it's a very visually ravishing version of slow motion, where you'll see a character kind of moving through the frame, and everyone around them has blurred into this. It's basically just this smear of color. It shows up at the beginning of Chungking Express. It's like one of his, I would say if I had to pick a signature shot, it's that one, honestly.
Totally.
And I think that speaks to the idea of his films. They're about city life in the sense that you have characters who are surrounded by people, but everyone around them sometimes feels like just this blur that they can't reach out and touch, really. You know, if that makes sense.
Right, exactly. And every single person is experiencing that all at once,
Yeah,
right? Like
yeah.
a room full of people who are all very alienated. I think it's essential to his work. The funny thing, you know, like that's definitely a visual signature of him. But when I think about Wong Kar Wai, another thing that I often think about is he is the king of pattern, like in the costumes and in the just wallpaper.
Yeah.
Just these really beautiful, lush patterns that I just love them. I think they're so beautiful. And he uses those in his films to great effect a lot of the time.
And that's another thing that I think you've seen other filmmakers pick up on without necessarily always even I mean, they're not even directly quoting Wong necessarily, but I mean, I might be crazy and I might be looking too much into this, but when I was first getting into Mad Men, when that show first started, I saw a little of his sensibility in its vision of the kind of glamour of the 1960s. Obviously, Mad Men is set in a totally different part of the world and is often anti-romantic in its notion of what these people's lives are actually like. But I think there is at least visually, I think that Weiner and his team were sometimes borrowing a little bit of the sort of glamour and cool of the 1960s.
Yeah, totally. And a couple of Wong's films are set in the early 1960s,
Yes.
Including one of his most famous and his most beautiful, arguably, In the Mood for Love, is set in the early 60s. And I mean, even if what we're talking about is just a byproduct of the style of the era, he's drawn to it for a reason.
Yep. So I would like to make a quick side note about Wong's name and the English pronunciation of it, because there is some discrepancy out there. I mean, I've again, having watched his films since college, the most common way I've heard it pronounced among English speakers and among American cinephiles is the way that we've been pronouncing it, which is Wong Kar Wai.
Yes, that's the common one I've heard. But, you know, I mean, phonetics in Chinese and English are so different. Please forgive us. It's so easy for Westerners to mess this stuff up.
Yeah, it really is. And preemptive apology to those who are like, no, that's not how you pronounce his name, because I have heard other pronunciations. People will sometimes call him Wong Kar Wai. I've also heard Wong Kar Wai. There is some debate about the English pronunciation. We're going to go with Wong Kar Wai. Obviously, if you're speaking Cantonese, for example, you will have probably a completely different pronunciation of his name. But we're going to go with Wong Kar Wai. Go with us here.
That seems to be the standardized, like, Western pronunciation.
I think it is the standardized Westernized pronunciation. And you'll never see, I mean, obviously you'll never see Wong, like, correct anyone in an interview or something. But like most of the time, even if like Scorsese will say Wong Kar Wai, you don't see. Well, of course, he's not going to interrupt. Another side note: I watched a very adorable interview with Wong Kar Wai and Martin Scorsese in preparation for this episode, and it begins with Wong Kar Wai saying, "I'm really honored to be here today with my hero." When they're talking.
Oh, it's so nice.
Yeah.
Oh, to be Martin Scorsese.
Yeah.
I mean, that guy's just collecting accolades everywhere he goes.
Yeah.
And he doesn't care about the people who don't like him, which is great. Because Wong Kar Wai likes him. What does he care?
Yeah, exactly. Top of the world, you know?
Yeah, he doesn't care if you tweet about him. Like, other legendary filmmakers all, come to, pay him tribute. What does he care?
Yeah.
Anyway, that's a side note. So, I think what we're getting at talking about, the essence of his films is these are very sensual experiences, his films. A lot of them have to do with romance and sex, and sort of to me, the quintessential Wong Kar Wai image is a sweaty couple laying in bed, the fan going in the background in some like beautifully shabby, little apartment room with beautiful wallpaper. Like that to me is the quintessential Wong Kar Wai image. And it is like, It is a cinema of like image and sound and that idea of pure cinema, right?
Mm-hmm. Yeah, I mean, I look at his work and I think when people talk about pure cinema, which is always, it could be kind of a redundant distinction. I mean, it is cinema that you're watching, of course, like the idea that there's a pure cinema. But I think the notion is that a cinema that is as much about its formal pleasures and about the application of technique and about the application of the pure aesthetic qualities of the medium as about anything they're being used to tell us about the story or the characters. I mean, like you look at Wong's films and they can be appreciated for what they're doing thematically and what they're doing in terms of story, but they can also just be appreciated as these gorgeous aesthetic objects and appreciated for what he's doing with light and color.
I think pure cinema is basically, it's a technical term for a type of cinema. Some cinema is story-driven, some's character-driven. And to me, pure cinema is kind of a technical term for, like you said, films that are aesthetic or image-driven, as opposed to, the other elements are not quite as well, I don't want to say not as important, but they're secondary.
Yeah. Well, I mean, I think you could say they're secondary when people are talking about pure cinema. I mean, they are talking about connecting primarily to what the filmmaker is doing with the craft of filmmaking, as opposed to movies as a story delivery system, which I think is the way that some people look at cinema.
Precisely.
So we should say that the impetus for talking about Wong Kar Wai this week, beyond the fact that he's always fun to talk about because he's a great filmmaker, I think I mentioned up top, but the Criterion Collection is releasing a box set of his work. And if you're unfamiliar with Wong, then I would honestly say that the best introduction to his work would be to just get your hands on this box set. Now, you may not have $160 to spare to buy this thing. It's a beautiful set.
It's so pretty.
It's very pretty. And it really does offer quite the overview of his body of work because all but he's made 10 features and all but 3 of them are included in this set. What you will not find in the new set is his wuxia film, Ashes of Time. That is not available. Either version of that. There's his original version, and there's also the version that went to theaters 10-ish years ago. Yeah. A recut of the film. That is not in this set. Neither version is in the set. My Blueberry Nights, which is his first film his first and thus far only film in the English language, stars Nora Jones. That is not available in the set either. And his most recent film, The Grandmaster, his kind of martial arts biopic, also not included. I'm guessing that's a rights thing.
The thing is like those films, I think that the films in this set are the films that encompass the particular Wong Kar Wai style that we're talking about, right? Like him as auteur. I think all the stuff in this set is what really, I mean, the first film in the set, we'll get into it in a second. The first film in his set doesn't have his signature style, but the rest do very strongly. So I think that as a sort of primer to his style, to understand what his style is, you can watch the box set and totally get that.
I would agree. Although I don't think, again, he's the type of filmmaker who is so unified in his themes and so unified in the look and feel of his movies that I think that these other films could easily be in the set as well, and it would still feel cohesive.
Totally.
Because honestly, the odd film out here is probably just My Blueberry Nights, and that film has tons of qualities where you would watch it and you would probably know it's him. The only thing that would really throw you is the fact that it's
in English.
In English, yeah, with American and British actors. So the films that are in the set, I'm just going to run through this real quickly. His 1988 debut, As Tears Go By, which is kind of a sort of his version of Mean Streets. It's probably the least distinctively Wong of all his films.
Yeah, it kind of shows his origins in the John Woo school of like heroic bloodshed.
Very much so.
These like romantic operatic gangster movies, which he did move away from. He kept the romance, but he moved away from the gangsters as time went on.
Yep. So from there, it goes on to his second feature, Days of Being Wild, which is his first film with Christopher Doyle, the famous cinematographer whose whose work on his movies would come to define their look and feel again. It's also considered the first part in an informal trilogy with In the Mood for Love in 2046 due to the time period, which is largely 1960s Hong Kong. Although, again, I think you could almost take 3 movies at random from Hong's whole body of work and put them together and call them a trilogy, you know?
Well, Chungking Express and right, like the next 2 films in this box set, Chungking Express and Fallen Angels, work as a pair.
Right, exactly. Yeah, I mean, because they were made more or less at the same time. Both films were made during the actually Wong was still working on Ashes of Time, which was a big sort of a big budget project for him, his big wuxia project, and he was on a break from that film, and he made these 2 films, Chungking Express and Fallen Angels. Chungking Express would become his big international breakthrough, the film that that introduced him to a lot of Western audiences.
Yes, it was out on Rolling Thunder Pictures on VHS and DVD back in the day.
Yeah, he caught the eye of Quentin Tarantino, and Tarantino could sort of see a kindred spirit in some of their concerns. And
oh, for sure.
Yeah.
And just the story structure of Chungking Express, where you have these, different characters kind of moving through each other's orbits, is Pulp Fiction-esque.
Very much so, yeah.
They share that.
Yep. And both came out in 1994. Which is very interesting. Fallen Angels was originally intended to be basically a third chapter in Chungking Express until Wong made the choice to sort of spin it off into its own movie. I think it wouldn't be so hard to see like a truncated version of Fallen Angels within Chungking Express. I mean, they even have, there's even some overlap in terms, there's like a gag about expired pineapple that shows up in both films.
Right. I
sort of think of Fallen Angels as the amnesiac to Chungking's Kid A, basically.
That's such a good way to put it, like, honestly.
Yeah, it's like, it almost feels like leftover material that has been shaped into something that has its own identity, and its own value. In any case, from there, Wong made Happy Together, which is a film about, it's sort of a doomed romance between these 2 men who are sort of falling in and out of each other's lives and out of this love story that they forged together. It is notable at the time for treating a same-sex relationship as something that was basically just no big deal. Which
it's incidental to the story itself. Although, I was rewatching this film recently, and I was thinking about, how Wong Kar Wai's films are all about alienation. And this film is about a semi-closeted gay expat, and how much more out of touch could you be with or out of step with the world around you can you be? It's a very isolating place to be. Number one, you're in another country. He's Chinese in Argentina, and there are not a lot of Chinese people in Argentina. Yeah. And he's, semi-closeted, where his coworkers and a lot of his friends don't know that he's gay, and that's a very lonely place to be.
That's true. Yeah, I don't think that the fact that the characters are gay is totally incidental. I do think the fact that the movie does not belabor that as something that's I mean, we're talking about a period of time in the late 90s when anything approaching mainstream film, if it was dealing with characters being gay, was often dealing with it in a way where that was like the headline. Sure.
Yeah. The era of like In and Out and stuff like
totally, that. Exactly. So, obviously not the only film to take this perspective on a queer romance, but even of the time period. But it did feel like him not making an enormous deal out of it was a big deal in 1997.
Yeah, that's kind of where the culture was at the time.
Exactly. So after Happy Together, he made In the Mood for Love, which is also in this box set. Kind of widely considered his masterpiece. Maggie Cheung and Tony Leung play neighbors in 1960s Hong Kong who more or less become infatuated with each other. Their spouses are having affairs, and it's sort of about this unspoken longing between them. This is kind of a
chance encounter thing, where they end up, like, they move in next to each other, which is one element of chance, and then their spouses start having an affair with each other, which is another element of chance. And so this is very much that, like, ships in the night kind of thing that Wong Kar Wai is really into.
Very much so. And it's also, I think that he is a filmmaker who gets unrequited desire really well. And the idea of obsessing over someone or something, but never never quite consummating that. And I think the question of, we talked about this film, by the way, recently on our Valentine's Day episode, because both of us agreed that this is one of the all-time great romantic films. I think part of that is the movie's notion that the raw, unconsummated attraction between two people can be as sexy as the two of them ravaging each other in a hotel room.
Yeah, having sex. Yeah.
Yeah.
Yeah, this movie's all about that kind of like, if I would... You know, I mean, obviously it has a storyline, but we were talking about pure cinema and sensuality. And if I had to say what this movie is about, it's about that feeling of when, you know, you're sitting next to somebody and you're pretty sure they like you the way you like them. And like you put your hands next to each other, you know, somebody yawns and kind of moves their arm and you're like about to touch, but you haven't quite touched yet. And that kind of like electric feeling, that's what this movie's about.
It that's great. And it agonizingly prolongs that moment. It's like, it basically is like a film that exists in that little pocket of air before two people kiss for the first time, but it exists in that space for 2 hours.
Yeah,
it's remarkable.
And the interesting thing, you know, a big part of the film is, like we said, their spouses are having an affair. And so the two main characters, who, by the way, are some of the most gorgeous people.
Two of the most beautiful movie stars in the world, you know?
Yes, it's Maggie Chung and Tony Leung are the two stars. Just absolutely beautiful people. And so they kind of play act at having an affair because their spouses are having an affair, ostensibly to understand what happened at first. Yeah. But then it kind of turns into this thing where they're play acting at being in love and falling in love in the process. But a big part of it is they're like, no, we're not like them. We're not going to consummate this affair.
It's really a wonderful film. And honestly, if you've not seen that one, Russia, turn off this podcast. Like, throw your headphones off, just run inside and watch this film. The last film in the set is 2046, which is kind of an unofficial, well, not unofficial, it's sort of a loose sequel to In the Mood for Love, in that Tony Leung's character, he's playing the same character in this film, again, kind of loosely, and he basically has never gotten over the relationship that we see in The Mood for Love, and he starts writing a sci-fi novel. It becomes this non-linear thing where we're jumping into multiple timelines. It's definitely one of Wong's most, I don't know, I guess I would say one of his most convoluted films in some respects.
Yeah, it's pretty complicated, you know, like time and brief moments in time that, you know, shift the way. I mean, I guess the best way to put it be like these brief moments in time that kind of shift the course of the river of your life is the way that I would put it.
Yeah.
Time is a big theme in his work, and he definitely deals that in the most complicated way in this film.
Yeah.
I think he's trying to work out some ideas explicitly that are kind of implicit in his other movies in 2046.
Totally.
So something we mentioned before that we could talk about in a little more detail is that Wong Kar Wai, he is part of the Hong Kong New Wave. And so this is something that started in the late 70s, around the same time that you had the film school generation coming up in the US. It was a very, you know, vital time around the world for filmmaking. And in Hong Kong, they had similar things going on where they were having film school graduates come into the system for the first time. And like we mentioned before, was John Woo is the biggest figure in the Hong Kong New Wave. He influenced a lot of different people. Choi Hark, if you're familiar with Chinese cinema at all, is another probably the second best known name in that first wave. Like, it's the Hong Kong New Wave, but there's the first wave and the second wave within the new wave, because this went on for a long time. This was like the 70s through the 90s. It basically lasted up until Hong Kong left the British Empire in the early 2000s, because it changed everything there.
Which, by the way, that's a major that is a major subtext of a lot of Wong's work, even though he always insists that his films are not overtly political, that he's not interested in that. But if what do they say? There's gold in them hills. If you want to go looking for that in his films, it's there, I think.
Yeah, absolutely. I mean, it's just one of those things that I think, I mean, I'm just speculating, of course, but I think it would be really hard to not have that on your mind.
Right.
Living in Hong Kong in the 90s.
Yeah.
You know? And so, the first wave, like I said, John Woo's style was super influential. And then, in the late 80s, early 90s, you start seeing the second wave of the new wave coming up. And Wong Kar Wai is, I would think, internationally by far the most famous director to come out of this wave. There's 4 or 5 different directors involved. Most of them are mostly famous in China and in Hong Kong. If you can just, I hate to even say look at Wikipedia, but if you want to get, a brief outline of the players, you can find that on Wikipedia. Fruit Chan, the director who made a kind of infamous movie called Dumplings, a horror movie called Dumplings that's in Three Extremes. Started as a short in Three Extremes, both of our favorite horror anthologies. Yep. He's probably the second most famous internationally director to come out of the second wave of the new wave. And like I said, John Woo is kind of the leading figure. He towers over everyone, even Wong Kar Wai. And so Wong Kar Wai was really, his career started to pick up steam around the same time that John Woo left Hong Kong for Hollywood. Mm-hmm. So in some ways, he kind of stepped into that role as the leading figure in Hong Kong filmmaking. And John Woo is known for a style known as heroic bloodshed. That's all about, it takes kind of crime and gangsters and elevates it to this big, sweeping, romantic, operatic thing. And so like you were saying before, Wong Kar Wai's first movie, As Tears Go By, is a gangster movie, and he started kind of working in that mold. But over time, he was always more interested in John Woo's movies are a lot of times about brotherly love and kind of bromances. Wong Kar Wai movies are just straight up romances. Right. This is more romantic, sexual kind of love as opposed to noble brotherhood. And that was kind of his big difference from the start. And but they both kind of had that same, they both take take their stories and really elevate them to these, big, beautiful spectacles.
I mean, As Tears Go By is the one that's the most sort of wooish in its own way. Mm-hmm. I think Wong was breaking into the industry at that time because some people were looking for who was going to be the next John Woo.
Yeah, because John Woo was very, very big. As Tears Go By came out in 88, and that was after A Better Tomorrow and The Killer. Mm-hmm. So John Woo was starting to get famous internationally. So I imagine people probably were looking for the next John Woo for sure.
Yeah, and honestly, you could see John Woo directing something like As Tears Go By. It is his most unambiguously. It's a genre movie. Some of his themes are there in nascent form. I sort of look at it and see it's. We talked earlier about him loving Martin Scorsese. I do really think that it's sort of his take on Mean Streets. It has that same relationship, two young gangsters. And one of them is sort of straight-laced, and the other one's this hothead. And the straight-laced guy is always trying to keep the hothead out of trouble. But you don't see a lot of the signatures that would show up in his work later.
Right. It was more his second film, Days of Being Wild, where his signature style kind of emerged fully formed, really. Mm-hmm. And something I want to emphasize talking about John Woo and Wong Kar Wai, I would not, Wong Kar Wai isn't trying to be John Woo. They just kind of were in each other's orbits and they were swimming in the same pool. I don't mean to connect them too strongly thematically because, like I said, Wong Kar Wai is more about sensuality and romantic love and sex and longing as opposed to violence, I guess.
I don't think it's outrageous to compare their work. I do think that they're very different and very distinctive artists, but I do think there is some commonality in their work. They have both shown an enduring interest in kind of gangster archetypes, Mm-hmm. They both love slow motion. And they're both big style over. I guess I hesitate to say style over substance, but they're both people who treat a project and a story as an opportunity to
style and substance, I guess.
Style and substance, yes.
Yeah.
They're both masters of high style, I would say, and
totally.
While those styles are very distinctive from each other, I do think there is some commonality between them in their work.
Yeah, and I think a key to kind of understanding the difference is that Wong Kar Wai started out writing soap operas. I
Right.
think that is a very that gives you kind of a clue to where the difference is there.
It's funny. I mean, he talks about. I think that he does not talk about that period of his career with a lot of fondness. I don't think that he enjoyed doing that. You know, this was before he started directing his own films. I think that he sort of
gotta pay rent. You know,
right. He sort of sees that as just like that was me coming up, and it's not like a period of his career that he's particularly proud of necessarily. But I do think it probably influenced his body of work going forward, because all of them, I mean, there is a soap opera quality about a number of his films, you know?
Yeah, or just the emphasis on romance.
Yeah, I mean, it's interesting too that Tarantino was essentially the filmmaker who exposed Wong to a lot of Western audiences, because I do think that they share some sensibilities too, developed probably around the same time, but completely separate from each other. You know, I think that Wong's thing, which is very similar, at least to what Tarantino was doing at the start of his career, is looking at these characters who are sort of prototypical genre movie archetypes. You know, you'll have like goons and gangsters and malls.
Killers and thieves.
Yeah, and asking what is the interior life of these characters? You know, what do they feel inside? Because I mean, like I was last night before we recorded, I was watching Fallen Angels again. And Fallen Angels follows a character who is a hitman, and you know, at the beginning, the movie's very cool, and the movie really revels in his sense of style and in the coolness of him going about his work. But then very early into the film, we get a scene of him sitting on a bus, and he's talking to an old high school classmate, and in the voiceover, he's talking about remembering his time in school, and we kind of get this look into the mundane side of his life. And I thought very strongly watching it that's kind of exactly what Tarantino does at the beginning of Pulp Fiction, where we have these two hitmen driving in their car talking about fast food. And again, it's not like Wong was influenced by Pulp Fiction. These two guys were just developing these ideas at the same time in different parts of the world.
I cannot imagine that they were aware of each other's projects when they were developing them. I would be very surprised to hear that they were aware of each other's work.
I mean, it's possible Wong had seen Reservoir Dogs at that point.
Yeah, but I mean, like Pulp Fiction and Chungking Express.
I mean, they were made pretty much at the same time, you know?
Exactly.
So, yeah.
Well, something with that, I think that those two, a key to that is those two kind of share a common influence in the French New Wave approach to gangster films, which is, similarly kind of irreverent and sort of interested in the everyday details, as opposed to the big macho violence of it.
Right.
And specifically, I think about Jean-Pierre Melville and Le Samouraï, the movie with Alain Delon from 1967. So that film it's about a contract killer, but it's also a romance, and it's very spare. There's not a lot of dialogue in The Samurai. There's this languid quality to the character that is kind of similar to a Wong Kar Wai character. And so I would think that those two probably share that as a touch point, and that kind of maybe accounts for the similarity.
So who else do you think has been were influences on Wong's work? Because I mean, we've talked about filmmakers he's influenced, and there's a number of them, but who else do you think sort of fed into his style and inspired him?
Well, I would definitely mention French New Wave, like Godard and Band of Outsiders. That particular approach to the crime film is pretty similar to what you would see in like Chungking Express, or like Jules and Jim, and the sort of the quirky proto-manic pixie dream girl kind of women that you see in some of those
the early
French
iconic
New Wave movies.
The early iconic New Wave films, the cool Godard films, not the esoteric, highly intellectual, sometimes impenetrable later Godard.
Right. I would say, the more populist side of Godard.
Yeah.
And Truffaut. I think you see some of that in Wong Kar Wai's work, too. Particularly, I'm thinking of, there's a character in Chungking Express. Her name is Faye, and she works at a food stall, and is always playing this ear-splittingly loud music. And she's definitely kind of a proto-manic pixie dream girl.
Yeah. So there's something I want to talk about the new box set. I mean, again, I do think that if you can afford it, this is you should probably buy it. And I do think that if you're unfamiliar with Wong's work, I mean, obviously it's a gamble to spend that kind of money on a filmmaker whose work you've never seen. But I do think that if you can get your hands on it, it really is a very good. I mean, any film in that collection would be a good into the work of Wong Kar Wai.
These films are on Criterion Channel too. I'll say that.
Oh yeah, great point.
I'm not sure if these are the restored versions on Criterion Channel, but like if you kind of want to sample before you buy the box set, you can watch these films on Criterion Channel.
Great point. And here's another thing too that does bear mentioning. There has been a little controversy around this set because. The versions of the films that we're getting are not necessarily just straight restorations. I mean, obviously, often when Criterion is releasing a box set of someone's work, or even it's just releasing something on Blu-ray, they will restore an original print of the film. So you're getting a really good-looking version of the film, and one that's often restored with help from the filmmaker. In this case, Wong was very involved in the restorations, but he kind of took it beyond simply restoring. He has altered some of these films in some ways.
Yes.
And in some cases, that means new crops. Like he's changing the aspect ratio a little bit. There's some
changing the color timing in some of them where the scenes have a more kind of greenish tint to them. He kind of messed with the different timelines in the films where he'll kind of grade flashbacks as green and then the present day as more white, as neutral.
Yeah, but it goes beyond even those stuff too. I mean, that's almost exclusively visual. I mean, he's also people have pointed out there are if you go to Reddit, you can find people talking about this on Reddit. There are at least a couple cases throughout, and I'm sure someone will make a definitive guide to this somewhere on the internet. But he is in a couple cases literally using different takes from the film, where he is like pulling a different take of a scene, and I don't know how you feel about it. For me, that's starting to cross the line into like you are fundamentally changing the movie that is being restored here, right?
Yeah. Well, okay, so I feel two different ways about the restorations. On the one hand, the changes in the color, some of the old Blu-rays and DVDs of his films were kind of washed out to the point where you didn't really see the subtleties in the picture. It would just be bathed in like blue or red or green, which is cool, but you lost some of the depth. And I think that the restorations kind of restore the depth and the subtleties in the color. And I actually prefer the restorations in that way. However, some of the more dramatic stuff he does, like changing things to black and white, is pretty dramatic. And there's something in Fallen Angels in particular where they took some shots and made them anamorphic, where they almost look like they were under fisheye lenses, that I actually didn't really care for aesthetically. I thought it was like a little too much.
Yeah, I mean, you and I could probably go back and forth talking about which of the changes we like and which ones we don't. I just think it's an interesting philosophical question to ask whether, at what point does a film stop being a filmmaker's and start being something that belongs to the collective movie-going public? I mean, it's obviously a question that has plagued George Lucas over the years. I mean, he's spent a lot of time going back and making changes to these movies, and I think, as with George Lucas, I think the Star Wars films, I think what has become a point of contention for people and an area of concern for people is that it's fine to offer different alternate versions of a film. You really just hope that you're going to be able to get your hands on the version that's existed for a long time,
Yes, I can totally see that, right. Like, as someone who has Star Wars on VHS because I refuse to buy versions. I get it, guys. And the funny thing is, we talk about George Lucas. For a different type of person, like a different type of movie lover, people are, I would say, as passionate about Wong Kar Wai as some people are about Star Wars.
So just as protective.
Really love this director.
Yeah, and one of the things I saw on that Reddit thread was that at least one person is convinced that in Chungking Express, he is using a different take of a particular shot. And, don't do that. Like, Chungking Express is, like, almost perfect, in my opinion. So
Right.
I don't want a different version of it. So, I don't know. It's an interesting question because, I mean, there's also the idea that, like, any home video version you see of a movie is arguably going to be not a bastardized version, but it's not going to be exactly how the movie looked or played on the big screen, or in the case of a lot of these films, on celluloid. I mean, obviously, Wong's work predates DCP. I mean, most of his films were shown in their quote unquote original format. They were on celluloid. You saw them on 35 millimeter. The idea,
and that has a particular texture all its own, right?
Right. And a lot of people discovered these films. I mean, like, if you were watching Chungking Express in the 90s when Rolling Thunder brought it to America, you may very well have been watching it on VHS, and watching that movie on VHS is obviously going to be a very different experience than watching it on celluloid, and watching it on Blu-ray now is going to be a different experience than watching it on celluloid. So
yeah, I'm so glad you brought up VHS, because there is, a portion of people who, even when there is like a restored director's cut 4K scan of something available, they still prefer to watch the VHS because that's what they have the fondest memories of.
Yeah.
And I think that does factor in here. Overall, I mean, and I think that it's a great point you made about the other versions still being available, because, you want to give people the opportunity to indulge that kind of nostalgic feeling, for sure.
Yeah.
But, I honestly think it's Wong's right to mess with his films if he wants to. And I think the restorations look pretty good. So it's not something that angers me. Actually, he wrote a note kind of explaining the restorations and his philosophy behind it and the changes he made. And I thought this was really poetic and very Wong Kar Wai. He talks about the saying, "No man ever steps in the same river twice, for it's not the same river and he's not the same man." And so then he writes, "Since the beginning of this process, these words have reminded me to treat this as an opportunity to present these restorations as a new work from a different vantage point in my career. I invite the audience to join me starting afresh, as these are not the same films and we are no longer the same audience." That's so Wong Kar Wai. Like, that is like...
Yeah. I mean,
it's a theme.
Yeah, very much, that we change over time and we're not the same person who we were later. That's all well and good, but I mean, the fact of the matter is those films did exist, and, I mean, there are plenty of us who do have a relationship to it, and it's not like all of these movies are widely available in a nice home video format. Some of them are. I mean, like, for example, I will be holding on to my Criterion Chungking Express Blu-ray that predates this set by many years, in which he has not swapped out any of the takes. It's purely a restoration. So
yeah. I can tell you really hold Chungking Express close to your heart.
I mean, it's among my favorite of all movies, and I don't want a different version of it. I mean, we could probably discuss this all day, honestly, because I do think there's something really interesting about alternate versions to movies, and how we get attached to particular versions, even versions that aren't necessarily better than the alternate versions. I think we talked a little bit about this when we first started doing the podcast. We talked about Dawn of the Dead, the George Romero film, and I remember talking about how I've never been able to force myself to watch any other cut of that film but the theatrical, because I always start it and it feels too different to this movie that I love, that's lived in my veins my whole life. That I just can't make myself watch a version that's slightly different, even if it's better. I think in the case of these movies, I think a lot of the changes are largely cosmetic, and you'll have to know these films like in and out to really recognize the difference with most of them. I think one of the ones that seems the most altered is Fallen Angels, and again, I think that's a lot of like... He does this like Sin City effect in one of them too, where he like colorizes aspects at like particular objects in the frame, and I don't love that effect, to be honest.
It's it's kind of a dated effect.
Yeah,
to be honest.
I sort of think
2005 to me.
Right. I sort of think that he maybe wanted to do that in 1995. and for whatever reason couldn't, and now he had the opportunity to do it. But it sticks out a little bit. But I will say that Fallen Angels is, of all his films, is the one that plays the most like just throwing all the style he can muster at the screen, everything in the kitchen sink, you know, and which is one of the reasons I love it, to be honest. It is just the epitome. It's the epitome of stylish cool to me.
That's funny because it's one of his lesser works, in my opinion, because I feel like a film like Chungking Express or Happy Together has a stronger kind of it's more firmly tethered to the ground. I think that the Fallen Angels kind of floats away a little bit for me.
Yeah, I mean, I definitely think it is it is very much a companion piece to Chungking Express and feels in some respects less substantial than that film, even though Chungking is probably his funniest and lightest film. It's kind of a darker flip side to that, and in some respects it might be one of his more inconsequential in terms of narrative, but in terms of style it just is. It is just, to me, it is just the epitome of cool. There's just nonstop cool in that film, you know?
Well, let's talk a little bit more about that style because, you know, we're talking about how Fallen Angels is the epitome of that style. And one thing I really like in Fallen Angels is there's these scenes throughout the film where one of the characters is she's at a jukebox in a bar and the song will play and she's kind of like languidly laying on the jukebox, you know, kind of like swaying to the music. And that's one of the things I really like about Fallen Angels. That's one of the things he does. And something he has in common with Tarantino, actually, is they both make really strong use of, although Wong Kar Wai doesn't exclusively use pop songs, he also uses snippets of score in very kind of bold ways in his films.
That's very true. Yeah, I mean, he obviously he loves music, and I would say he uses it in a way that's adjacent to, but not necessarily identical to the way that a lot of people from the Tarantino and post-Tarantino school would. It's almost never. He doesn't do that thing where it's. He's not one to ironically use a song.
Yes, I was going to say that. It's not ironic. It enhances the emotion. It's very earnest, and it is meant to enhance the emotion of the scene.
Right. It's never at odds with it. It's never like it's never an act of contrast. It's always about enhancing mood because his films are all about generating and enhancing a mood. You know. Mm-hmm. Yeah. I mean, there are a number of techniques that have become sort of associated with his work that people that sort of define a Wong Kar Wai film. I mean, he tends to. Him and Christopher Doyle, who shot a lot of his films, tend to shoot handheld, so you're kind of roving around the streets a lot. He loves rapturous close-ups.
Yes,
fan of those.
I've noticed he really likes a close-up of the back of a woman's neck where her hair is put up, and a few little pieces are falling off onto the neck. That's one of his favorites.
There's a lot of that in The Mood for Love, which is, again, a film about... It's so appropriate for that film because it's a film about getting infatuated with every part of a person. And in that film, he... I don't think it's particularly... It's interesting. I think it's adoring, not leering. And I think that he sexualizes both of the actors in that film, but never in a way that always, to me, felt very romantic and not really... gross and ugly, you know?
Yeah, no, I don't think that movie, Maggie Cheung, the female lead, I don't think that movie oversteps her boundaries at any point, the characters or the actresses.
Totally. So he also, I mean, he loves slow motion. He loves, we talked about this earlier, there's this motion blur effect that he loves, that he uses a lot in Chungking Express that involves step printing. I don't have the technical know-how to quite explain that process, but in effect, it ends up basically... There is a character who is in the center of the frame who is sort of stepping in and out of focus, and everyone around them is basically this blur of motion and color.
Yeah, and that color is a big signature of his. This really deep, vibrant color, like if. Like in Happy Together, for example, the room, these two men are staying in a one little tiny room together throughout a lot of the movie.
Yep.
And it's sort of this rundown kind of boarding house, but it has this beautiful green, this jewel green shade over the lamp that kind of throws the light over the whole room.
Yeah, Wong has a way of making both the most opulent and the most squalid spaces look beautiful.
Yes. You know? He excels at that thing of like artfully scattering things around the frame. He's really good at that.
Yeah. So he also low-key illumination is a big part of his filming technique. He loves contrast. He will sometimes shoot through panes of glass for distortion effect, but also for the way the light hits the glass. There's a lot of that in my Blueberry Nights, by the way.
Like, it's beautiful, but it also it fits thematically. Like, we were talking about how cohesive all his films are, and that is true in the sense of, like, there are certain recurring themes. And one thing I noticed is that the time of 3:00 in the morning shows up in a lot of his films.
Oh, interesting.
There's several of his films. Someone says, "What time is it?" And it's always 3 a.m.
Huh.
Like he is coherent on that level, but also on the level to where I think that's why we were hesitating to say it's style for style's sake, because the style reinforces the theme and the emotion so well.
Totally. It feeds into all the ideas he's going for. And I mean, I think that Wong fundamentally is a filmmaker who is interested in there is an emotional logic to his films, and that is the guiding principle. Like he organizes his films around an emotional logic, not necessarily a narrative one. And so that is always what is guiding the experience. And it speaks to, if we can talk briefly about his shooting method as well, which I think is interesting. I think that Wong is somebody who, he's tinkering so much right now with when making this box set, he went back and he tinkered so much with these old cuts of the films and took the restoration process as an excuse to mess with the movie some more, which is really, I think, which is not that surprising, because Wong is definitely the type of filmmaker who will spend as long as possible working on a film, sort of finding it along the way as he can. He belongs to that kind of Cassavetes school where he will sort of get a group of collaborators together, and they will meet in a space, and they'll sort of put together the movie as they go, sometimes without even a finished script.
This is too seat of the pants for me. I don't have the confidence.
Yeah, I mean, I think
to work in that way.
You either have to be a fool or a genius to do it, and I think that there are filmmakers who have tried to do it and created complete messes. I think that Wong usually pulls it together. I was going to say that it sort of falls in the Terrence Malick tradition, but I actually think that Malick sort of adopted that particular style. I don't want to say after Wong, but at least like you can actually see Wong's influence on Malick's later work. I think both visually and in terms of a working process. I mean, his movies sort of give off the impression that they are perpetual works in progress. Again, I think he's organizing them around emotion, not plot. And I think that occasionally that turns into these really protracted shoots that must drive investors crazy. I mean, he shot In the Mood for Love for 30 weeks and supposedly drove his cast and crew to some degree of exasperation. For a while, it was not even clear exactly what the movie was until they found it. And he's done that again since. I mean, I think 2046, he took twice as long. That movie famously was barely ready in time for its Cannes premiere. And so there's a lot of time spent shooting it, but there's also a lot of time spent in the editing room finding the movie. And I think usually he finds the movie, Oh,
yeah, he finds the movie. I was already kind of aware of Wong Kar Wai's work by the time 2046 was coming out. And I remember there was a lot of angst about, oh, this movie's taking a whole year to shoot. What's happening? One of those quote unquote troubled productions you hear about sometimes.
And I think that in that case, you can sort of see, it's interesting because with 2046, I think you can see the impression of a piece of work that has been that's been in production for a very long time. Like 2046 is a work that fundamentally feels like it is constantly reworking itself, and that it's a work in progress. And I think that does suit its themes, actually.
Yeah, it does. Yeah, even the troubled productions, it ties in, right?
Yep.
Because that film's kind of about working and reworking your past and your life.
Totally.
Yeah.
But then you look at it, In the Mood for Love, and I would never guess that that's a movie that didn't have an extremely direct notion of what it was going for from the start, because it is so controlled. Yes, because it's so
elegant.
Yeah. And can you imagine? I mean, we think a lot in American cinema. There are a lot of young indie filmmakers who will improvise their way into a movie. You know, you'll sort of get together a bunch of young actors and just sort of create a movie. They're improvising their dialogue. It's a much different thing to do that when you're making a film that's set 30 years in the past, where there's all these elements that require an enormous amount of production design and a lot of...
Yes, I was going to say, like, intensely detailed production design.
Right. Wong is not throwing a party and just having his actors improvise the dialogue. He is like, they're like building sets and like bringing in all sorts of vintage elements, you know. I mean, so it's an interesting combination of a sort of improvisational production style and an enormous amount of preparation as well, just in terms of bringing the world that the film occupies to life.
Yeah, totally. Absolutely.
Yeah, and so thematically, Wong has made a remarkably consistent body of work. I mean, he has particular themes that are of paramount importance to him that he just keeps revisiting, which I think is a reflection of the way that his characters tend to think too. I mean, his films are all about longing.
Yeah. To lift the curtain for a second, for our listeners, we make outlines for these shows, and Dowd wrote "longing" in all caps on this one. And I was like, yeah, that's about right.
I just sort of feel like that is the defining feeling of his films.
Absolutely.
You know?
Absolutely. I think all of his characters kind of fall on this spectrum where on the one end you have completely detached, like, cool, and on the other end you have intensely lonely, melancholy, nostalgic longing. And it's all kind of the same emotional spectrum, I think.
Yeah, well, because honestly, I think that even those detached characters, because you're right that he sometimes has these characters who are these kind of slick womanizers or these gangsters who seem to be pretty emotionless about what they're doing. Almost always in his films, it's revealed that those characters are either hiding this wellspring of feeling or having crushed it down. I mean, 2046 is all about the version of Tony Leung who we meet in 2046 is like a crueler, more callous, and more detached version of the character we meet in The Mood for Love. But that almost becomes its own kind of mission statement because Wong is sort of saying that in his movies, when you're running into characters who are these kind of these cold lady killers, often those are characters who have been put through the ringer of romance in the past. You know?
Right, yeah. And the past and being hung up on something in your past is like a really big theme in his work that comes up over and over again. And I kind of see that as, you know, I've brought up time a few times, and there's a monograph about Wong Kar Wai called Auteur of Time. It's a big thing with him. He's really big on this idea of, like, you know, life being a river, like he used in his statement, and just flowing down the river of time and ephemerality, and the fact that, like, everything beautiful must pass. I think I think that's where a lot of the poignancy in his films come from, and he does it through the medium of heartache and breakup stories, I think.
Yeah, because I mean, on a more superficial level, I think he might be the ultimate breakup filmmaker. I mean, I think his movie,
Totally.
He's made so many movies that are about the breakup blues, you know, and how it feels to want someone back, to lose somebody and want someone back. I mean, Chungking Express, we talked earlier about getting into his films, but Chungking Express will definitely speaks to lovelorn young people, I think.
Yeah, totally. That's what makes it so perfect. He's like the perfect director to get into when you're college age, I think.
Yeah. Yeah, I think so. And I wanted to mention this actually before, but I'm just going to bring it up now. If you are somebody who has moved to the city from someplace else and you're new to the city and you feel both the sadness and the romance of feeling kind of alienated but also excited about the place, Wong captures that better than any other filmmaker, even when his films are not. I mean, very few of his films are expressly about that particular experience, but they end up capturing that anyway. You know?
Yes, absolutely. Yeah, absolutely. It's a bit, yeah.
Yeah, I mean, I think that one reason that Wong is so beloved, and that the themes are so resonant to a lot of cinephiles, is that they do dovetail with a kind of love of movies. I mean, this is kind of an abstract idea, but I mean, when you're in love with movies, I mean, you are you are building an obsession with the past, aren't you? I mean, you are on a very literal level, you are building an obsession with images of a dead past. You know?
Yeah, you're trying to take a beautiful moment and kind of freeze it forever.
Right.
When you're shooting a scene in a film, right?
Yes, exactly. You are immortalizing a moment in time. And I think that when we fall in love with movies, we are falling in love with those images out of time. And I think that resonates so much with what Wong's whole body of work is about. Okay, Katie, so what is your favorite Wong Kar Wai movie?
My favorite Wong Kar Wai movie is In the Mood for Love. It is one of my top 5 films of all time. It is an unabashed 5 stars for me, and I'm not very generous with a full 5 stars. I just think it's so beautiful on every level. It's so heartbreaking. It's so beautiful to look at. So, it's just exquisite. Like, the word exquisite is the only word that I can use to describe that film.
Yeah, I sometimes think of, there are certain films that I feel like when I watch them that I want to live in them. Almost. And it's not even necessarily about identifying with the characters or even about like envying their life or anything. It's about just wanting to exist in that world as long as possible. Yeah. You know, yes. and In the Mood for Love is a movie that makes me feel that. I want to live in that movie, and every time I watch it I feel like I get to exist in this space for 2 hours, and I cherish that experience.
Yeah, totally. And I'm not gonna, I'm definitely not going to spoil it here, but it has one of the most poignant endings of any film I've ever seen.
I would agree.
So heartbreaking.
Yeah.
How about you?
For me, it's Chungking Express. And, I'll admit that there could be some, appropriately, given that we're talking about Wong Kar Wai's films, there could be an element of nostalgia at play there, that this was the first Wong Kar Wai movie I saw and the first one I fell in love with. But it has an energy that's just different than his other films in some respects. There's a certain, I agree. There's certain lightness of step to it, you know?
Yes.
I mean, it's kind of, it is a romantic comedy in some respects.
Yeah. No, this one is more funny. Like there's more humor to this one. And it does, we were talking about the city. I think when you talk about like the energy of the city, I think Chungking Express captures that so well.
Yes.
This one is very high up there for me too. I would give In the Mood for Love like a little bit of an edge, but I rewatched this a couple days ago. It holds up so well. Yeah. Like, wow. Yeah.
Just scene for scene, moment for moment. It's one of those films too where you're just like, you could admire every shot in the film in a way. Mm-hmm. There's like a whole world in every single shot of the film. I won't get too much into the plot of the film. It's more or less 2 love stories that briefly intersect, but mostly are separate. So it tells 2 stories, both about police officers who are sort of on the business end. The same
beat.
Yeah, they're on the same beat, and they're both kind of nursing their wounds from a breakup. And it's about how they move on from that, and about relationships of sorts that they forge. It is,
and it's not just about them though, because the film also spends a good amount of time with these women that they encounter that kind of change, kind of shake them out of this ennui that they're in, these police officers.
You mentioned off mic that you thought that Chungking Express is the Manic Pixie Dream Girl convention with, obviously that's a term that our own Nathan Rabin once coined, but that this is one of the earlier examples of that in the 90s, that there is a character in this who is basically a Manic Pixie Dream Girl. But who I will say I think she's kind of quintessentially fits that role, but I find it delightful in this film, I have to say.
Yeah, that's to this film's credit. That is one of the things that makes it so amazing, is you're watching it being like, yeah, this person would be really annoying if you if you worked at that snack shop with her, you probably would find her very annoying, but you find her charming in the film.
Yeah, I mean, she's almost like at times she feels almost like a force of nature. I mean,
yes, totally. Yeah, totally.
By the way, if you hate the song California Dreaming, you may have a hard time with Chungking Express, because it definitely gets played, I'd say 8 or 9 times in the film, probably.
Yeah, but there's also a Chinese language cover of the Cranberries, which is amazing.
Oh, that cover of Dreams, which, by the way, one of the many signs that Sofia Coppola was deeply influenced by Wong Kar Wai is that I believe that same version pops up in Lost in Translation as well.
There you go.
Yep.
There you go. Yeah. I think Chungking Express is a relatively accessible film, too.
Yeah.
I think it would be a good intro to Wong Kar Wai if you were just going to watch one. Because the two storylines, I think that they keep the film, they hold the film down to the extent to where, like, you don't get lost in the style.
Right. Yeah. No, I think that if you're looking for an entryway into the films of Wong Kar Wai, that Chungking Express is the perfect one. Again, I say that as somebody who it was my entryway into his films, but it has so much of what you want out of this filmmaker's body of work. I mean, it has the ecstatic style, it has the heartache, it has the mood, but it's also it kind of is in its own way a light little confection.
Yeah, and it's got a little bit of underworld gangster elements to it,
That's
but not heavy. It doesn't dominate the film.
Yeah, so you watch this and you like it. You can get into some of his other work, which gets a little heavy, a little more emotionally heavy, I think. This is not one of his most heartbreaking films. So yeah, I think it's I think you're right that it's a great entryway into his body of work. I would also say that Fallen Angels would be a fine one too, if only for just a sense of how stylish his films are. Because again, I think that movie is just like from the jump, it's just a nonstop parade of amazing stylistic quirks.
All right, folks, that's all we've got for you this week. The World of Wong Kar Wai box set from the Criterion Collection will be out on Blu-ray on March 23rd, 2021. In the meantime, please be sure to rate, review, and subscribe to Film Club wherever you get your podcasts.
This week's episode of Film Club was hosted by me, Alex Dowd, and by Katie Rife. Produced and edited by Carl Blomberg. Sound mixer and finishing editor is Zach Goldsboro, and our motion graphics designer is Julie Mullins. Please join us next week. Katie will actually be off. She's covering the South by Southwest Film Festival, but we'll have a very special guest on to discuss the DCEU in anticipation of the Snyder Cut finally hitting HBO Max. We'll see you then.
Bye.